On January 13th, 2012, when the Costa Concordia left the port of Civitavecchia, on board were 3,206 passengers and more than 1,000 crew members. Most were ready for a week of fun in the Mediterranean. For the first 2 hours, the trip was calm, but Captain Francesco Cecchino had something different in mind. He wanted the ship to sail very close to the island of Giglio. This risky move was known as a salute. Sometimes captains do it to impress locals on shore or to give passengers a better view, but it wasn't part of the official route. The company, Costa Crociere, later said this maneuver was not authorized. It was Cecchino's personal choice, and he made the decision late, when the ship was already moving at about 16 knots, too fast to be that close to land. As the island came into sight, Cecchino gave the helmsman new coordinates. He even added a warning. "Otherwise, we go on the rocks." Passengers noticed the ship turning toward the shore. Many thought it was exciting. Some waved to people on the island, who waved back. From the outside, it looked like nothing was wrong. But under the water, hidden in the dark, was a group of rocks called the Skull Rocks. The Costa Concordia was heading straight for them. Cecchino had made his move too late. At 9:45 p.m. local time, the Costa Concordia slammed into the Skull Rocks off the island of Giglio. The collision ripped open a gash more than 50 meters long on the ship's left side, tearing into the engine rooms. Seawater surged in immediately, flooding compartments and cutting off power. The effect on board was instant. Lights flickered and went dark. Elevators stopped between floors. In the dining rooms, passengers felt the ship shudder violently as glasses shattered and plates flew from tables. Some thought it might just be turbulence or a blackout, but the grinding of metal against rock and the sudden lean of the ship told a different story. On the bridge, alarms started to scream. Engineers tried to start the emergency generator, but it failed. The ship was powerless, drifting, and taking on water fast. Captain Francesco Cecchino reacted by ordering a sharp turn to starboard, steering back toward Giglio. It was a desperate maneuver, but it may have prevented an even greater tragedy. If the Concordia had continued straight, it would have sunk quickly in deep water. Instead, the crippled vessel began drifting slowly toward shallower seas near the island. The turn slowed the ship's speed. At 9:49 p.m., it was crawling at just over 6 knots. By 9:53, it was barely moving at 3 knots. The once grand cruise liner was now limping toward the coast, its fate sealed. At 10:12 p.m., the Italian Coast Guard, already receiving calls from frightened passengers on shore, contacted the bridge. Captain Cecchino replied calmly, "We have a blackout. We are checking the situation." He did not mention the massive gash in the hull or the flooding engine rooms. 10 minutes later, at 10:22, Cecchino allowed his radio operator to call again, this time requesting tugboats and admitting to a failure on board. But still he insisted passengers had life jackets, no one was hurt, and everything was under control. Meanwhile, chaos was spreading below. Water rushed into the lower decks. Cabins were already flooding. The ship began to list more sharply as the seawater shifted inside the hull. In the corridors, luggage, bottles, and furniture slid across the floors. Families struggled to keep their children from falling as stairways tilted into steep climbs. But nearly 50 minutes after the collision, the general emergency alarm was raised. Passengers were ordered to muster stations. But by then, the angle of the ship made movement difficult. On the low side, lifeboats were unusable, because they hung against the water. At 10:48, the Concordia rolled further, leaning more than 30 degrees to its right side. 10 minutes later, the ship's engines stopped completely. The Concordia drifted to a halt just outside Giglio Porto, its lights still glowing weakly against the dark sea. But the ship capsized onto its starboard side, resting on a rocky ledge below the surface. The enormous vessel, once a floating city of luxury, was now half submerged, tilted at a deadly angle. Schettino's desperate turn had brought the ship close enough to land for rescue boats to reach it. That choice probably saved thousands of lives. But inside, more than 4,000 passengers and crew were still trapped in confusion and fear. Then came the most shocking moment of all. At 11:19 p.m., while hundreds of passengers were still trapped on board, Captain Schettino left the bridge. The man in charge of the Costa Concordia, the one person who should have stayed until the very end, simply walked away, leaving his officers to handle the evacuation. 13 minutes later, at 11:32, even the second master abandoned the bridge. The Coast Guard could hardly believe it. At 12:42 a.m., Commander Gregorio De Falco made a furious radio call, demanding that Schettino return to his ship. His order became infamous, but Schettino never did. He stayed on shore while his passengers and crew fought for their lives in the darkness. When the Costa Concordia went down, it left behind a 114,000-ton wreck lying on its side, only meters from the island of Giglio. For engineers, it was one of the greatest challenges in maritime history. How to remove a ship this massive without breaking it apart or spilling fuel into the sea. At first, experts debated whether the Concordia should simply be dismantled where it rested, but Italy made a bold decision that the ship would be refloated and removed in one piece. The contract went to Titan Salvage, an American company, and Mico Peri, an Italian marine firm. The operation began in February 2012. The first step was to pump out more than 2,000 tons of fuel to prevent an environmental disaster. By March, that delicate job was done. Next came the most complex phase, parbuckling. Parbuckling meant rolling the ship upright. Engineers built a massive platform on the seabed and attached giant steel sponsons, like floating boxes, to the side of the wreck. On September 17, 2013, the world watched live as cranes and cables slowly pulled the ship upright over the course of 19 hours. For the first time since the crash, the Concordia was vertical again. But the job wasn't over. The wreck was too damaged to float on its own, so more sponsons were added to the other side. And then engineers pumped air into the tanks, making them act like giant floats. Slowly, the ship began to rise. On July 23, 2014, the Costa Concordia started its final journey. Escorted by a fleet of tugboats and support ships, it was towed at just 2 knots across the sea to the port of Genoa. 4 days later, it arrived to be scrapped. The entire operation cost more than 1.5 billion euros, making it the most expensive maritime salvage in history. But it also became an engineering triumph. A wreck that many thought could never be moved was refloated, transported, and dismantled without breaking apart. The scale of the disaster was clear. 32 people had lost their lives. Thousands more had been scarred by hours of chaos and fear. The captain, Francesco Schettino, became the face of the tragedy. In 2015, an Italian court sentenced him to 16 years in prison for manslaughter, causing a shipwreck, and abandoning ship. To many, he became a symbol of arrogance and cowardice. His decision to sail dangerously close to shore, his long delay in sounding the alarm, and finally, his choice to abandon the ship before all passengers were safe. These actions shocked the world. At the same time, it revealed moments of courage, crew members who risked themselves to save others, Coast Guard officers who pressed for action, and ordinary passengers who helped strangers escape. On July 7, 2017, the last pieces of the ship were dismantled in Genoa. 100 years after Titanic, another great passenger ship had been lost. The wreck of the Costa Concordia may be gone, but its lessons remain.